Hello and welcome to Face Off here on France 24. Competitiveness. The word has been barely uttered by the socialist François Hollande during the presidential campaign, but now not a day passes without hearing the word. France needs to become more competitive. Competitiveness is the buzzword, and the government just announced a new raft of measures aimed at boosting, well, you guessed it, competitiveness. In doing so, the socialists are reneging on some of their core commitments at a time when the popularity of the president and the prime minister is plunging. So to discuss whether the socialists can survive the economic storm, but also those dire polling figures, is Philip Turle, who is our colleague from Radio France Internationale, and John Keating, who is the correspondent of Kuwait's Kuna News Agency and also the president of the Anglo-American Press Association. Welcome to you too. Let's first take a look at the measures that were announced by the Prime Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault this week.
The French government gave a tougher-than-expected response and decided to keep most of the measures put forward in the Gallois report. The industrialist Louis Gallois had said many major policies must be put in place to reverse years of industrial decline in France. The main measure the government has decided to implement are tax breaks for businesses of 20 billion euros over 3 years.
The tax breaks will encourage France's big companies, whose success is a source of pride for the country, to create and keep jobs in France.
The tax breaks will be funded by a 10 billion euro cut in public spending and by a rise of the standard rate in VAT from 19.6 to 20%. The intermediate rate of VAT, which applies to restaurants, will also increase from 7 to 10%. The Prime Minister said the poorest families would not be penalised.
The minimum rate of VAT, which applies to basic products like food and energy, will be cut from 5.5 to 5%.
The government, which suffers from low approval ratings, now hopes these new measures will help boost the struggling French economy.
John Keating, there was a lot of speculation about this report by Louis Gallois, what it would say, and then, number two, what the government would do with it. Are you surprised by the announcements of the government?
No, I'm not. I think this has been on the cards for a long time. It was never announced previously. I think that the government has not just come up with these measures out of the blue. This has been prepared for a long time. The economy is in a very, very serious situation. Competitiveness is a big factor. France is losing market share in Europe. It's more in world trade, European trade. The deficits are increasing, so something has to be done. And France is basically following recommendations that have been coming, not all of the recommendations, but some recommendations from organizations like the OECD, for instance, which has recommended structural reform. And the IMF has also been pushing France. So I'm not surprised. I'm surprised by some of the adjustments, some of the changes there are 19 decisions taken by the Prime Minister on this. And he's readjusted the way they will be implemented. But basically, the Gallois report and even the Employers' Federation is happy, which is very unusual with a socialist government, have the Employers' Federation to be quite happy with the way the government is acting.
So the question is, are the socialists becoming free marketeers? I mean, if they follow the recommendations of the OECD, the IMF, and they make the bosses happy, what does it mean to be socialist?
Well, the interesting thing about this is that if you remember, before this election, Nicolas Sarkozy had come up with an idea to try to make France more competitive, to introduce what was called the social VAT rate, which was to make it easier for businesses to function by cutting the labour costs within business. And when François Hollande, which never actually went through, when François Hollande was in the campaign, he said, we're not going to do that, we're going to do something completely different, we never follow this plan that Nicolas Sarkozy has come up with. Now he's in office, they've had this competitivity plan by Louis Gallois, which has been presented to the Prime Minister this week. And what do we see they're doing? They're doing almost the same as what Nicolas Sarkozy would have done had he remained in office, which means that somewhere along the line, the money's got to be found to keep the economy going. Now, the problem is either we maintain the social system in France i.e. schools, hospitals, police, ambulances, which are all paid for by state money, but we've got to get the money from somewhere. So we increase taxes on people. That's going to cut public spending, therefore businesses will suffer. Or we reduce the taxes to give people more money and to make them able to spend more, but we've got to get the money from somewhere. So this is like a sort of compromise deal somewhere, if you like, along the middle of the line, which means that businesses will have a tax break, which means that they will pay less, so they'll be able to produce more. And they've increased the VAT rate for everybody, which means that we'll pay more for certain things, but only the very poor families will not pay more for heating and medicine and food, which will actually work out being a little bit cheaper. So they hope that with this measure they're going to kickstart the economy. The big problem is we don't know at the moment what the growth rate is going to be in France in 2013. The government's hoping for 0.8%, but the way things are going at the moment, it looks like it's going to be a lot less, at maybe only 0.4%. And that is where the problem is going to lie for the government now.
John Keating, on two key points. Cost of labor. The socialists have trumpeted for years, for months during the campaign, that this is not the reason why France is not competitive. There are other factors. Now we hear that cost of labor is indeed a factor. And number two, VAT, as Philip just said. François Hollande bashed Nicolas Sarkozy for trying to increase the VAT rate, saying it's unfair. And now we have a VAT hike.
Well, labour costs obviously are a huge factor, and especially as the Galois report and many of the other economic experts
But not for the socialists, until now.
Until now, but the link between is where the problem is. The high labour costs are not giving the productivity that we would expect for those labour costs, and they have to come down. And France is pricing itself out of the international market with the labour costs. It's 20% more than the average in Europe. So it's higher than Germany. And the Germans have gone through this painful exercise before. Under Schröder, and Ayrault mentioned this several times, that he didn't agree with Schröder at the time. They imposed tough reforms on labour and labour costs. And at the time, the French socialists were against this. But now they're coming more and more to the realization that it has to be done. It has to be done. And there's more that has to be done. And there's some contradictions in these measures. For me, for instance, to increase the cost on residential investment, for instance, renovations of apartments, etc., it was already 5%, increased to 7%, that's now 10% VAT. That's going to put a brake on people who want to renovate their apartments and invest, and for small builders, etc. It's going to be, quite a considerable difference. Some of the measures, restaurants, I think that's going to cut back consumption. So we're going to have a lot of people who are going to be crimped by these increases in VAT, which are not going to take place straight away. And the government has kept its word, no increase in 2013. The increases will be gradually implemented. So I think, as Philip said, we're not going to see how this will pan out till 2014 at the earliest. And also the IMF, 0.4% is what we're looking at, and not 0.8% next year in GDP growth.
There's two other things also which are important to note. The first one is that France has come under a lot of warning from International Monetary Fund, from the World Bank, from others saying
European Commission just said growth will not be as important as the French government claims.
Otherwise, you're going to go the same way as Italy and maybe Spain as well. So France has got to do something to stem in all this spending to cut its deficit. France is saying, well, okay, we can do that, but we think that we can find a way out of this, and we can be like the Swedish model, if you like. We can maintain a strong social sector within France that will care for the population, at the same time reduce public spending. That's the way this government, this socialist government in France, is operating. It doesn't want to slash public spending left, right and centre and undermine schools and the hospitals. It wants to keep all that
Although
going.
in this new raft of measures, there's a 10 billion cut in public spending just a few weeks after the government already announced such a cut and said we couldn't do more. Obviously, there's more that can be done.
Well, when you need to do more, you can do more. If they need to find the money, they'll have to get it from somewhere. There's another element which is quite important in this, which is something that we haven't touched on or heard much about over the last few days, because we've been talking about the increase in VAT and cutting labour costs. France is behind in its technological development. It needs to spend more money on research. It needs to come up with more up-to-date models, maybe, for example, in the car industry. It's lagging seriously behind Germany. France hasn't got the reputation of producing top-class products, and it's suffering as a result of that from other European countries, notably Germany, of course, which is what people will buy because you will buy a BMW or a Mercedes or a German car in the place of a French car, maybe because you'll think that a German car is better built and will be more reliable. And France suffers from this image deficit on the world market, which it's trying very hard to build up on. And that is the second element of this Gallois report, to make France more competitive. It means more research, more technological know-how, and more investment in French products to bring them up to the same standard as some of its European neighbours.
From a political standpoint, is Hollande taking a risk by endorsing measures that could have been taken by a conservative government?
I don't think so. I think people are.
But first of all, do you agree that he is betraying, quote unquote, his campaign promises?
He has gone back on one particular promise, which is the VAT. That he's gone back on that. But I think that, we have to give people more credit for than we do sometimes for realizing the seriousness of the economic situation and the need to revitalize French industry, which has now dropped. Industrial activity is now 10% of GDP, down below 10%. And also the need to innovate. France seems to have lost its impetus to innovate in industry. And that's where, I joined my colleague here on this, on the need to invest. The investment in industry has dropped down.
But do you think the socialist government was naive? Didn't they realize the situation was as bad as they seem to be saying?
I would find that hard to believe.
I think they were not naive, but I think when you have an election in a country, which we had, of course, in May this year in France, you can say what you like. You can say, we're going to do this. We're going to reduce VAT down to 0%. We're going to give free vacations to everybody because you want to be elected.
They didn't say that.
They didn't say that. And you can go, as I'm exaggerating, but anything goes to get into office, almost. If you can make people believe your pledges, well, you'll get elected, which is what they did. But
that's
they were
politics.
elected because there was an enormous frustration and fatigue with the government of Nicolas Sarkozy. So they said, OK, we've got a new guy coming along, he seems honest, he seems to have a good project, we'll elect him in. Now he's in office, it's a whole different situation because the problems are still the same and there are not an awful lot of ways out of it. So the first thing he's going to have to do is he's going to break an election promise not to increase the VAT rate, which is what we're going to have following the publication of this report.
And it may not be the last promise.
And it may not be the last one. Where the problem is for François Hollande is his credibility not on the world scene, but in France, where he's constantly coming under attack from the right, which is much more virulent than it used to be towards the Socialist Party, because it's now in the opposition. So every opportunity it's got to shoot down François Hollande, to criticise what he does, to say you're copying the ideas that we have, it will do, and that will undermine his standing in France. And one of the things he had to increase the VAT right to be able to get this through, to make this work, but that, of course, is going to be food for the right-wing opposition to say, well, you've broken your election promise not to increase VAT, so therefore you're a president who cannot be depended upon.
Take a step back from politics. Take a step back from politics. The technocrats, the senior officials in the administration, they don't change from administration to administration, socialist or whatever. The politicians do. The message is coming clear from them. It's coming clear from the ones before. It's coming clear from the ones who are still there. They're the same ones. And from the international institutions, the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF. You can't remain deaf to this message forever. And you have to take the risk, you have to take the chances, and you have to take the decisions. And I think that's what the government has done. They have no other choice right now.
Okay, on those words of wisdom, thank you very much to both of you. And thank you for watching this edition of Face Off here on France 24. See you next week.